Welcome to Breaking the Cycle of Poverty, featuring Jay Height, Executive Director of Shepherd Community Center in Indianapolis. My name is Tim Swearens, and I'm your host for these conversations that explore why poverty remains such a persistent problem in the United States. On this episode, Jay discusses with Dr. Tim Streett a new book that Tim has written about 10 essential assets for breaking free of poverty. Jay, will you introduce Tim once again to our listeners?
It's always exciting for me to be able to introduce my good friend and colleague, Tim Streett. Tim and I have served together for almost 2 decades, and we've both seen each other's kids grow up, and his work is instrumental in understanding the why of Shepherd. And so we're excited about his work in this new book that really, I think, summarizes that foundation for who we are and how we do what we do.
Yeah. Tim, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Give us a summary of the book. What's the main thesis?
Well, obviously, the main thesis is simply the 10 asset model of ministry that we use here at Shepherd. As I was saying earlier, when I go out and teach Poverty 101 somewhere, or some of the other classes I teach, when we start talking about the assets, it just resonates with people. It makes a lot of sense. Probably the two biggest feedback, the feedback we get most consistently is either somebody who doesn't know a lot about poverty who says, you just taught me a lot, and I learned lots of new stuff. Or the person who's been working, on the issue of poverty, working with people in poverty for a very long time, who then say, I didn't necessarily learn anything entirely new today, but you gave me a framework for all what I know, a framework that I've lacked, that I've really needed, and a framework that can help us move forward in our programming choices and things like that. And I'm constantly being asked, have you written a book on this? Right. And for about the last 4 or 5 years, the answer's been, I'm working on it. Yeah. And now the answer is yeah. So hopefully we're going to be able to get this, in the hands of lots of people that I can't necessarily be there to teach, but who will gain from the things that we've learned, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So we've talked in detail about the 10 assets on this podcast in the past, but can you give kind of a summary for people who may not be familiar with them?
Well, basically the concept of the assets is that there are a lot of things that differentiate the lives of people who live in poverty from the lives of those who live in the middle class. And when you think of poverty as simply a lack of material resources, well, that's an easy fix. All you need to do is give material resources to people in poverty. And that's mostly what we've been doing in this war on poverty that we've been waging now since 1964, when Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty in his State of the Union address. Most of the government work is about supplementing that. Mm-hmm. But anybody who works with people in poverty, anybody who's ever experienced poverty themselves, will tell you one thing, and that's that poverty is about a lot more than money. And years and years ago, really just started trying to figure out what are those other things that it's all about, and eventually came to a list of what we call our 10 assets. And they are, one of those assets is income, but it's number 10 on the list. Mm-hmm. And the first 9 are non-monetary assets that we believe people in the middle class use and have great agency with. They use for their stability. And it's really all about stability. Matter of fact, we have a phrase that I like to use here called upward stability versus upward mobility, mm-hmm. That we really pursue empowering our families to become more and more stable, because income does not necessarily produce stability, but stability can produce income because people stay in jobs longer, stay in apartments longer, and things like that. And so these are the things that we believe that the middle class relies upon for its stability beyond income, that are very, very important to, for our families trying to break the cycle of poverty to be able to use in their own lives.
Yeah. So the writing process can help us to see things in a new perspective, things we've known for a long time. Oh, yeah. But when you have to sit down and write it, you're looking. So any fresh insights on the 10 assets as you were writing?
Well, I did a PhD dissertation a few years ago where we figured out how to measure the assets mm-hmm. In an individual, and then the study that I did was able to quantify the assets, mm-hmm. and we gave a survey to 5,000 people and quantifying the assets in each person who did the survey. And then we're able to establish whether or not there's a correlation between their agency with the assets and their socioeconomic status, which is about the only thing we could use as a proxy for stability. And we were able to prove a strong correlation. And so then also then how do the individual assets correlate to socioeconomic status, and then how do the individual assets interact with one another? How do they grow together? How do they influence one another? But then nobody wants to read a PhD dissertation. Pretty boring. And but then so over the years, I've taught so many things on the assets and written anecdotes and. So the book is primarily about combining the anecdotal evidence that we have here at Shepherd, all our stories and things like that, with the the data and the research in the dissertation, and a lot of things have come to mind. Just any writer will tell you, this is my first time, but having read others, trying to figure out how to articulate it in writing helps you think through the process.
Yes.
One of the things is that in just doing lots of reading, the title of the book has kind of changed. Originally, it was The 10 Assets. Now we're calling it Asset-Based Human Development, which I think fits in much better with the idea of human flourishing, which we talk about a lot and things like that. And the subtitle is what it takes to become a stable adult and how the church can help.
Yeah.
And the other important part about it, though, I think in changing the title away from a specific list of 10 assets that you need to be focused on, they're in there, but we're now focusing on more just the concept of empowering people with these assets, and I think rather than be a to-do list of things that you want to do, we're giving people a framework that they can use to decide what do we do in our context. Because I get people all the time who ask me, hey, would you come and would you research, would you look at everything we're doing and then tell us what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing, or would you come in and help us start stuff and give us some ideas? My answer is always no, because that's what a consultant does. I'm not a consultant. But I can maybe come in and we can talk and I can teach and I can share stories and principles and the things that we've learned over the years, including the mistakes that we've made, and maybe and hopefully give you a framework to answer those questions for yourself. Because the primary answer to the question, what should we be doing here, is, comes down to what you're passionate about. What your context is, needs, what you are gifted to do, what is available, and things like that. And so this has now become more of a framework, I think, and describing it more as a framework that people can use to guide decision-making as they move forward in attempting to empower people in poverty to break the cycle, rather than a to-do list.
Yeah. I think also a powerful part of this, and even in the title, asset-based human development, we talk in terms of community asset-based community development, ABCD, where you don't go in and say, what are all the problems? You say, what are the assets here? Well, it's the same thing. Government looks and says, here's the problems you have, and I'm going to give you this stuff. And that never builds any capacity. If we want to grow capacity to reduce dependency, it's building the assets so they don't continue to need us. And the safety net as designed doesn't do that.
So Jay, how do you and the team at Shepherd use these assets in shaping ministry?
Well, we're going to say, what's this program and how are we building these assets into the program? Making sure it's more than just we're engaging with them in some fun or that type of stuff. It's okay, in the design of the program, how are we building human assets?
Yeah, and just today I was kind of interacting with an article that talked about social capital. And there's social wealth and social poverty, and the author was talking about how children who grow up in wealth, or at least in middle class, develop that social wealth, and children who grow up in poverty lack it. And he talked about social wealth, and he defined it in sort of vague terms what it means. I mean, it was a very good article description. But I think when we talk about that social wealth, if you look at our list of the assets, we have support we have self-advocacy, and we have knowledge of dominant culture. And it's as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, what we've done is we've kind of broken down that concept of social wealth into its three components. Mm-hmm. And when you break it down into components like that, then you can program around them. Teaching a child to advocate for themselves, or how organizations function and how to get things done in society, which is an important thing to be able to do if you're going to break the cycle of poverty. Then we can say, oh, well, let's match them up in this, let's put them in this situation and teach them how to respond, much like a parent does. Right. I always say, middle-class parents, educated parents, when they talk to their children about going out into the world, there's always a conversation something like this. Hey, we're going to the doctor, and I've always, up to now, done all the talking for you. But I think it's time for you to do the talking for yourself. So what are you going to say to the doctor? And you literally practice the conversation with them. Yeah. I remember when my son, even after high school, after, he was doing his gap year in Colorado, and he had to advocate for himself to get housing at the ski resort where he was working, and I was sitting in the coffee shop across the street, and he came back 3 times, disappointed by their response, and each time I was able to coach them. Mm-hmm. Well, a child who grows up in that household gets that coaching throughout their lives. Yes. A child who grows up in a household of poverty doesn't. And so it gives us a framework to say, how do we teach those kinds of things? Through mentoring, through experiences and things like that.
Yeah, and you said going back 3 times, because one of the things we've talked about is, taking the first no, and it's like, oh, well, what do I do now? It's like they said no.
Yeah.
And having that social capital to say, well, just because they said no the first time doesn't mean it's a permanent no.
Right, and one of the basic tenets of the middle class is don't take no for an answer.
Yes, yes.
Don't annoy people, but ask it in a different way, pursue it, those kinds of things.
Yeah. We've talked about, I grew up in a family that didn't have a lot of money, but I was surrounded by books and magazines and newspapers, and it was a wealth of knowledge and information and learning happening in the home, even though we didn't have a lot of money. But that was because my parents had, that experience, and kids who lack that are so often so far behind. So.
Yeah. Many times poverty is the lack of access. It's not the lack of resource. Is there enough food in Indiana for absolutely, but not everyone has the access. And many times we wrongly create the prescription to be, well, I got to go find them and give this to them, as opposed to helping them build the access and advocate for themselves.
Yeah, and you hear people kind of all the time say, "Well, I grew up poor, I just didn't know it."
Right.
And chances are they grew up in a household that lacked income or a sufficient income, maybe, but was rich in other ways, as you were describing. I mean, I tell people all the time, I love thinking of life this way because it constantly reminds me of how rich an experience my kids had growing up. Even though we lived in a relatively poor neighborhood and didn't necessarily have a lot more money than our neighbors, but our kids were having an entirely different experience because of the relationships that they had, and and the things that they were being taught in their home, and the experiences they were given through grandma and grandpa for travel and other things like that. So.
Yeah. So, Tim, what's the status of the book?
Well, it's sitting right here on the table, which is basically it. It's finished. I'm constantly working on continuing to edit it, but we are hoping, to find a publisher. I've started contacting publishers and literary agents. It's a tough challenge because most publishers don't accept unsolicited manuscripts, and I've discovered that even most agents don't accept unsolicited manuscripts, and so you have to find somebody. Like the rest of the world. I mean, it's interesting because my experience is just in the last few weeks in trying to promote this book and find a publisher is a little bit like what Jay was just saying. It's a lack of access, and it's almost analogous to kids growing up in poverty. Is that you got to know somebody,
right?
And that person's got to be willing to support you. You can't just because you've written something great or you have a particular talent doesn't mean you're going to find an outlet for that talent. It's about connections. It's about knowing how systems work and organizations function, and everything like that. And so right now we're hoping and praying for a literary agent who deals in Christian nonfiction to find me or me to find him and or her and find the book and the main reason we wrote the book is simply, as I said earlier, people are always asking. We want we just want more and more people to be able to read it, to understand what we've learned here at Shepherd and hopefully be able to apply it in their context.
Jay, if we have a listener who's listening to this and they say, "Hey, I want to help," how can they go about helping?
Yeah, they could call Shepherd 317-375-0203. Tim Streett, they could leave a message for Tim, or Tim S at shepherdcommunity.org is his email. It's always our first name and first initial of the last name, Tim S at shepherdcommunity.org. And they could reach out to me, and I'd be happy to connect them. This is so exciting because part of the calling of Shepherd is to change the world.
Yes.
And this is the way we can do that from the lessons learned in the east side of Indianapolis in the Martindale, Brightwood, Near East Side, Southeast Side community.
Thank you, Tim and Jay. For 41 years, Shepherd Community has made a lasting difference in the lives of thousands and thousands of neighbors. The Shepherd team couldn't do that work without the support of donors, partners, and volunteers. To learn more about how you can help, please visit shepherdcommunity.org. Thank you for listening.
Thanks.
Thank you.